The day the lawyer called, I was standing in my kitchen in socks that had a hole in the left toe, eating peanut butter straight from the jar with a spoon. That detail matters because it tells you exactly where I was in my life. Not rock bottom, I want to be clear about that. I was not dramatic enough for rock bottom. I was just in between. In between what I had expected my life to look like and what it actually was. The jar was almost empty. The spoon was the big one, the serving spoon, because all the regular ones were still in the drying rack, and I didn't want to walk 4 steps to get one. That is the level of effort I was operating at in those days. The phone rang, and I looked at it the way you look at a ringing phone when you're in the middle of not doing anything important, which is to say, with mild irritation and a sense that answering it would require more of me than I currently had. But I answered. And the voice on the other end said my name in a way that made me set the peanut butter jar down on the counter very slowly, the spoon still sticking up out of it. "Is this Clara Marsh?" "Yes." "Miss Marsh, my name is Gerald Osai. I'm a partner at Osai and Whitmore. I'm calling regarding the estate of your grandfather, William James Marsh." I remember the refrigerator humming. I remember that specifically, the sound the refrigerator makes when the kitchen is so quiet that it becomes the loudest thing in the room. I had not spoken to my grandfather in almost 3 years, not because I didn't love him, but because loving someone and being in the same room as someone had, in my family, always been two very different things. $82 million, Mr. Osai said, and then he said it again, slowly, as if he understood that the first time it had simply bounced off the surface of me without going in. "Your grandfather has left you the entirety of his estate, $82 million plus the house on Calder Lane." I said nothing for a long time. The refrigerator kept humming. "My name is Clara Marsh, and I am not the person you think I am. I know what the headline sounds like. I know what you're picturing, some polished woman in a blazer, someone with a plan, someone who knew this was coming. I was none of those things. I was 31 years old, and I worked as a copy editor for a small regional magazine that covered things like local restaurant openings and city council decisions. I was good at it. I was precise and quiet, and I caught errors that other people missed, and I earned $41,000 a year doing it. And I went home to a 1-bedroom apartment with a radiator that clanged every night at 2 in the morning like someone was knocking from inside the wall. I had a habit. Every morning, before anything else, before coffee, before my phone, I sat at the small table by my window and I read. Just 15 minutes. Sometimes a novel, sometimes a short story collection, sometimes just a poem I'd folded into my bag weeks ago and forgotten about. It was the one thing in my day that was entirely mine. No one had asked me to do it. No one would notice if I stopped. But I never stopped. That table by the window. I want you to hold that image for a moment, because I'll come back to it. The scratched wooden surface, the ring stain from a mug of tea I'd left there so many times it had become permanent, the way the early light came through at an angle in winter and made everything look softer than it was. That was me, precise, quiet, easily missed. The daughter who had learned, somewhere around age 9 or 10, that being easy was the same thing as being good, and that being good meant you didn't ask for anything, because asking for things made the air in the house go tight in a way that was worse than just going without. I had learned this specifically by watching what happened when my brother Marcus asked for things, and got them. Marcus was 3 years older than me, and he was, in the language of our household, the one with potential. I don't say that with cruelty. I say it the way I would describe the weather on a particular afternoon. It was simply the climate we all lived in. Marcus was brilliant and charismatic, and he burned bright in a way that made our parents orbit him without even seeming to notice they were doing it. He was also, if I'm being careful and fair about this, genuinely talented. He could walk into a room and make everyone in it feel like they'd been waiting for him specifically. He had ideas that tumbled out of him fast and electric. He was the kind of person that teachers remembered and strangers remembered, and our parents, especially our parents, remembered even when he wasn't in the room. I was the kind of person who did her homework at the kitchen table while that happened. There were small things I noticed but never spoke out loud. The way the good china always came out when Marcus brought a friend home, but not when I did. The way my mother would light up at the sound of his car in the driveway in a way that was just slightly different from the way she greeted me, not dramatically different, not cinematic, just a small additional wattage. The way my father, at the dinner table, angled his body slightly toward Marcus when Marcus was speaking. A subtle physical lean I only noticed because I spent so much of my life watching people and transcribing what they did without saying. And the money. This is important, and I'm going to say it plainly. When Marcus was 24, my parents gave him $120,000. A loan, they called it, for his first business. The business failed, as first businesses often do, and the loan was quietly reclassified in the family's shared understanding as a gift, and no one said anything directly, and I didn't say anything either because I was 21 and still learning the grammar of my own feelings. When I was 26, I asked my parents if they could lend me $8,000 to cover a short gap while I transitioned between jobs. My father rubbed the back of his neck. My mother looked at her hands. They said they would think about it. They thought about it for 2 weeks, and then told me they didn't have it available right now. I said okay, I found another way, I always did. The warning signs were there. I just hadn't yet learned that warning signs are things you see clearly only from the other side of what they were warning you about. I found out about the will the way most people find out about things they were never meant to know, by accident, in a moment so ordinary it had no right to contain something that large. My grandfather had been ill for about 8 months. I knew this not because my parents had told me, but because my grandfather himself had called me one evening in February, unprompted, to talk. He did that sometimes, called without occasion, just to hear my voice, he said. We would talk about whatever I was reading, about the weather in his city versus mine, about a documentary he had watched and wanted to discuss with someone careful enough to discuss it with. He called me careful. He said it like it was the rarest thing. In that February call, he had told me quietly that his heart was not cooperating the way it used to. He didn't make a drama of it. He said it the way he said most things, with a kind of settled plainness, like someone who has already made peace with the grammar of a difficult sentence. I had cried after we hung up. Sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, the phone still warm in my hand. He died in April. A Tuesday. I found out from a cousin's message in the family group chat, which I had been silently reading for years without contributing to, because the dynamic in that group chat was its own kind of weather system I had learned to shelter from. I went to the funeral. I sat near the back. My parents were in the front row with Marcus, and Marcus had his hand on my mother's back, and the three of them made a shape that looked complete, and I sat in my row and looked at the flowers they'd chosen, white lilies, which my grandfather had explicitly told me once he found funereal flowers depressing. And I held the service booklet in both hands, and I did not cry, not then, because grief had a strange way of waiting in me until I was somewhere private. It was 3 weeks after the funeral that Mr. Osai called. And it was not until I was sitting across from him in his office, in a chair that was too soft and too nice for the amount of confusion I was currently experiencing, that he said the thing I was not prepared for. Miss Marsh, your grandfather amended his will 14 months ago. He removed your parents and your brother as primary beneficiaries. He left the entirety of his estate to you. The room had that particular quiet that offices have at 10 in the morning, phones somewhere distant, the muffled sound of traffic, the almost inaudible hum of the ventilation system. All of it very far away. Why, I said, and it wasn't really a question. It came out as just a word, incomplete, dropped into the air between us. Mr. Ose reached across the desk and slid a sealed envelope toward me. My name was on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. His handwriting had always looked like it was trying to be legible but couldn't quite commit. I knew it immediately. He asked me to give you this, Mr. Osai said. He said you would understand it better than anyone. I picked up the envelope and held it in my lap. I did not open it in the office. I needed to be somewhere private for that too. I want to tell you about the drive home, because that was where the conversation happened. The one I had dreaded and not known I was dreading until it arrived. My mother called before I had even reached the parking garage. I let it ring. She called again. I let it ring again. By the time I reached my car and sat down and put both hands on the steering wheel and just breathed for a moment, I had 4 missed calls. 2 from my mother, 1 from Marcus, 1 from my father. I called my mother back. Clara, her voice was tight in a way it got when she was trying to sound calm. We need to talk about your grandfather's estate. Okay, I said. I want you to understand that your father and we were as surprised as anyone. Your grandfather he made some decisions at the end that I don't think were entirely. Mom. Rational, he was ill, Clara, and I think his judgment. Mom. She stopped. Mr. Osai said he amended the will 14 months ago, I said. That's not a deathbed decision. He knew what he was doing. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear her breathing. You're right, she said, and then more quietly, I know you're right. We didn't say anything for a moment. Marcus is very upset, she said finally. And I waited for myself to feel something about that guilt or the old familiar urge to fix it, to say something soothing, to shrink myself back down to the size that fit comfortably in the family's architecture. I waited for it. It didn't come. I know, I said. I'm sorry he's upset. Clara. I'll call you tomorrow, Mom. I need to drive home. I hung up. I sat in the parking garage for a long time. The fluorescent lights hummed, and I thought about my grandfather, who used to call me careful, and about the envelope in my bag, and about peanut butter eaten with a serving spoon in a kitchen where the refrigerator was the loudest thing. Then Marcus called, and I answered because Marcus and I had always been something more complicated than adversaries, and I owed him at least the dignity of picking up. What did you do? He said, not a question, an accusation, flat and tired. Marcus, I didn't do anything. I didn't know. He barely saw you. The last 3 years, you barely. He called me, I said, and my voice stayed steady in a way that surprised me. Every few months, he called me to talk about books, about whatever he was thinking about. He called me because I stopped. He called me because I listened. The silence that followed was not an angry silence. It was something more complicated than anger. I'm not going to fight you, Marcus said finally. I want you to know that. I know, I said. But this isn't fair, Clara. I know that too, I said. And I meant it. Not because I agreed with him, but because I understood that fairness and what had actually happened were living in 2 different houses, and they had not been talking to each other for a very long time. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and not in the way you would expect. I didn't feel like someone who had inherited $82 million. I felt like someone who had been handed a language they didn't speak yet and been told to navigate in it. I went to work. I edited articles about restaurant openings and city council meetings. I came home. I ate things I could make without thinking. For 3 days in a row, I had the same dinner, rice and whatever vegetables were going soft in the crisper, and I didn't register that this was something I could now change. The letter from my grandfather I read on the night I got home from the lawyer's office. Sitting at the small table by the window, the one with the tea stain. The words were in his half-legible handwriting, and they were not dramatic or ornate. He did not explain himself at length. He was, as he had always been, precise. He wrote that he had watched, over the course of many years, the particular way a family can love someone without seeing them. He wrote that he had seen it happen to my grandmother, too, before she passed, the way her contributions went uncounted, her steadiness taken for granted, her presence assumed without being valued. He wrote that he was not trying to punish anyone. He was trying to correct a record. He wrote, I have always believed that the person who pays the closest attention deserves the most trust. And you, Clara, have always paid the closest attention. He ended with one sentence that I read 3 times in a row, then folded the letter and held it in both hands. I won't repeat that sentence here. Some things belong only to the person they were written for. But the tea stain on the table seemed different after that. Not new, just seen, like it had always been there, and I had never really looked at it directly until now. The song I could not hear for a long time after all of this. A particular old jazz record my grandfather used to play during our phone calls, just barely audible in the background. Whenever I heard anything like it in a cafe or a store, I would feel something move through my chest that had no proper name, and I would pay for whatever I was buying and leave. The food I couldn't eat, my mother's cooking, not because I was angry, but because it tasted like a version of home I was no longer sure I had access to. We were in contact, my mother and we were careful with each other, but the warmth had been replaced by something that was trying very hard to become warmth again and wasn't there yet. The time of day that was hardest. Early morning, at the table by the window, when I tried to read and instead found myself just sitting there watching the light change. The turning point was not dramatic. I want to say that clearly because when people hear turning point, they expect something cinematic, a sunset, a revelation, a moment of swelling music. Mine was a Tuesday in October. I was at the copy shop 2 blocks from my apartment, making a print of a document from Mr. Osai's office that I needed to review, and the machine jammed, and I stood there in that particular fluorescent-lit silence waiting for it to unkind itself, and I looked down at my hands. My hands were just my hands. They looked the same as they always had. The same bitten thumbnail on the right. The same small scar near the left index finger from a kitchen accident when I was 19. Ordinary hands. And it occurred to me, for the first time with the full weight of actually meaning it, nothing about me had changed. The money was real. I had read the documents. I had met with Mr. Osai twice and a financial advisor once. I had sat in rooms that felt like other people's rooms and signed things, and nodded when I was supposed to nod. But standing in the copy shop with the machine jammed and the overhead light making everything slightly yellow, I understood something I hadn't been able to name until that exact moment. My grandfather had not made me someone new. He had confirmed someone who had always been there. I said this to myself, quietly, not out loud, but in the way you say something to yourself when you're really trying to hear it. He saw me. He saw me. That's all this is. The machine unk-jammed itself. I collected my papers. I walked home. And when I got to my apartment, I sat at the table by the window and I did not try to read. I just sat with the morning light, the scratched wood, the tea stain, and I let myself feel exactly what I felt, which was something quieter than happiness and heavier than relief and more mine than anything anyone had ever handed me. That was the day I stopped waiting for my life to be confirmed by someone else's witness of it. I hired no one to rebuild my life for me. That felt important. I moved slowly and I moved small. I paid off the remainder of my student loans on a Wednesday afternoon, seated at my laptop, and the confirmation email arrived, and I stared at it for a long time and felt almost nothing except a kind of low, clean absence. The way a headache you've had so long you've stopped noticing it lifts, and the absence itself is the feeling. I kept my job for 3 more months. This surprised people when I told them later, but I needed the rhythm. I needed to still be someone who caught errors in other people's work, who made sure the grammar was right, who showed up and was useful in a small and specific way. I was not ready to be formless yet. I called my financial advisor, a woman named Priya who had a direct, unhurried way of speaking that made complicated things feel manageable, and I told her I did not want to do anything dramatic or fast. She said, "Good." Just that. Good. And we made a plan that was careful and slow, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like being careful was actually the right strategy instead of a consolation prize. There was one person who helped, not by doing anything in particular, just by being exactly who she was, unchanged, while everything else shifted. Her name was Dora, and she was my colleague at the magazine, and she knew the full story by then because I had told her on a park bench in September, the full version, no summary, just the actual thing. She had listened without her face doing any of the things people's faces do when they're trying to figure out how to react. She'd just listened. And when I finished, she said, "Okay, do you want to get soup? I've been wanting soup all day." We got soup. She never once mentioned the money in a way that made it feel like the money. She just kept being Dora, asked me how the reading was going, complained about the deputy editor's track changes, sent me articles she thought I'd find interesting. And I want to say something about that kind of friendship, which is that it is rarer than most people know, and it is not small. It is one of the things that actually holds you up when the floor has changed under your feet. The table by the window, I moved it in November, just a few feet to the left, closer to the radiator, because the mornings were getting cold and the window draft was too much. Same table, same tea stain, same scratched surface, but in a new position, catching different light. And I noticed, for the first time, that the light from that slightly different angle made the ring stain almost look intentional, like a detail someone had placed there on purpose. I started reading again in the mornings. Nothing had changed about the habit, but something had changed about what it felt like. It felt less like the one thing in my day that was mine and more like one of many things that were mine. The distinction is smaller than it sounds. The distinction is everything.